Today I'm speaking with Stephanie Logan. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, Tim, it's nice to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Sure, absolutely. And Stephanie is a blogger. She has a blog, which I'll have the link for beneath our video here, but it's called Snickle Fritz Chronicles, which in a minute I want to hear where that name comes from because it's a very unique name. She's a former evangelical homeschool mom and a one-time missionary and pastor's wife, which we'll get into during the interview. She currently works in education with career coaching and advising. She was a graduate of Toccoa Falls College, a Christian and Missionary Alliance school in North Georgia, and she's starting a master's degree this fall. She also has 3 adult children. So if you could start with telling us what Snickle Fritz is all about, and then tell us more about yourself.
Snickle Fritz is a word that is really common up in Pennsylvania Dutch country. I was raised in Pennsylvania, and it basically means a rascally little child who talks a lot. It's often a nickname given to little boys, but my grandparents called me Snickle Fritz because I just couldn't stop talking a lot when I was a little kid. And so that's where it comes from. My maternal grandparents, I had a good relationship with them, and they were really encouragers in my life. So when I think back on my childhood and a lifelong progression, I often think of how they influenced me. And so it just kind of stuck that was the name I wanted to use for the blog. So
I like that. What, just out of curiosity, what part of Pennsylvania were you from?
um, most of the time I was raised just north of Pittsburgh, about
Okay.
40-minute drive. But for maybe second grade through sixth grade, I was actually in a small Appalachian town, almost at the border with New York State. So
Nice, nice. That sounds like a beautiful part of the state. I was
yeah,
more
it
from
is.
Lancaster County, but
Okay.
we had a lot of
Okay.
Dutch country there
Yes,
too.
exactly. Yeah,
Very
definitely.
cool.
Much more than the Western side.
Yeah. Well, I like to always ask people to, for in terms of like an icebreaker, tell us something else, quirky and fun about your hobbies or interests or whatever comes to mind.
Oh gosh. I think that perhaps the quirkiest thing about me would be I have a ridiculous love for the Pink Panther. Like going back to the old films, the cartoons when I was a kid, I loved them. I actually have a Pink Panther doll that sits in my bedroom.
That's
um,
awesome.
I love the Steve Martin version too. I love that kind of just absolutely ridiculous comedy. So
It's funny you say that because my kids just came across the Pink Panther cartoons like in the last month and
oh gee.
they've been watching them like crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a DVD of them, so that maybe someday I can show my grandchildren.
That's awesome. Well, the reason we obviously get together here on this channel on Harmonic Atheists is to hear people's stories. I love just being able to kind of pass the ball to people and give them the floor to tell their stories. So if you could start us from the earliest stage, what were the influences that shaped your worldview and your faith, and how did it change over the years?
Well, my parents met in a like a Christian youth choir kind of club group. Um, and from birth, I was in the church. I was baptized in my grandparents' conservative Presbyterian church, and as an infant, and then my earliest memories, just being in the church on Sundays, were in this little fire hall, where this little congregation met. Kind in Pennsylvania, I'm not sure if it's the same on the eastern side, but in the western side of the state, fire halls have like a reception center, and that's kind of another way they make some money. And so the church my parents were attending met in the reception center side of this fire hall. So those are kind of my earliest memories. And then when my parents divorced, when I was around age 7, is when I got into a different environment in the church. Um, I talk about it in my blog. My dad came out to my mom in the early 80s, and she exposed him then, as a good Christian woman is probably likely to do, telling everyone to pray and um, telling everybody what was going on in their marriage and trying to fix him and get people to help him. And in that event, she exposed him to the whole community, really to all his family, all her family. And then in the process of the divorce, moved us to a small town in the mountains, up almost in New York State. And it's where my aunt and uncle lived. And my aunt had, though she had been raised Presbyterian, she had gotten properly saved thanks to the outreach of this Christian Missionary Alliance church. And so when we moved up to this small town in the mountains, we started to attend my aunt's church. And that's where I really started to be fed the gospel in the very strong evangelical. The Christian Missionary Alliance is a holiness movement church. So sanctification and is a big part of it. So the fourfold gospel of the Christian Missionary Alliance is Jesus as Savior, Sanctifier, Healer, and Coming King. So I had gone from this more traditional church background to suddenly being thrown into children's clubs and strict Bible memorization and a congregation where an altar call was really, really common. And getting saved was really, really important. And so around age 8, I'm not one of those people who can peg the day. I don't have a day I got saved. But around age 8, I responded to a Sunday school altar call and got saved. And that kind of set me on the track of becoming very serious in the faith very quickly. And the church was essentially my focus, even from a young age. So really early on.
Could I ask, when you mentioned coming to faith in the gospel,
Mm-hmm.
I know that, people who aren't Christians might not know what that word means, but for even those of us who are from a Christian background, it can be defined a little bit differently. And you mentioned the holiness movement. I'm not sure exactly. I know what the word holiness means, but what they would preach. But just starting with the gospel, if you were, in that church and the preacher was giving the beginning of the altar call message, and you had to summarize it in 2 or 3 minutes, what would you say the gospels that they were preaching that you believed in?
So the gospel, as it would have been preached in the Christian Missionary Alliance, is that it's pretty standard. We are sinners, and even our best efforts are filthy rags. We can't please God with anything we do. So we need the redemption of the blood of Christ. And so Jesus was sacrificed to redeem us from our sin and buy us out of our slavery to sin back to Christ, or to God. And through that redemption, we can connect with the Lord. So that is, essentially the basics of the gospel message. The CNMA doesn't leave it there, though. With sanctification, they preach that he doesn't just buy you out of sin. He doesn't just redeem you. He helps you to stop sinning. And if you really love and honor him, that's the route you're going to go. So that's the concept of the holiness movement. It isn't just, oh, you get saved and it's an insurance policy. It's more than that. Yeah.
It sounds vaguely familiar to me from the context of, are you familiar with the term lordship salvation?
Yes.
When I was growing up, I got exposed to it. I'll just take a second to share this, but when I was growing up, I got exposed heavily to John MacArthur, who had a book called, I think it's called The Gospel According to Jesus, but you could have subtitled it the Lordship Salvation, or it may have been backwards there, but basically saying what you just said, that, yes, there's a simple gospel, but it's like God isn't saving you just to get you out of hell. He actually wants you. He wants you to be his child. He wants you to be his servant.
Right.
He wants to be a pure vessel. And that if this is truly a work of the Holy Spirit isn't just going to like do all this hard work to get you out of sin and then stop. The Holy Spirit's going to keep working you. And if you're familiar too, there's a guy from World War II, a pastor who got killed, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, The Cost of Discipleship. And then Dr. Jim Boyce from 10th Press in Philadelphia, he had a book that was very similar. But those influences hit me with exactly what you're saying. Like, if you are truly saved, you're going to truly be holy because it's the Spirit's
Right.
going to transform you. But I'm
Right.
curious, in that context for you, did it create at all a dynamic of questioning ever where you'd say, if I'm not holy enough-ish, is that evidence that I'm not saved? Like, did you doubt, or did you feel secure in your salvation?
Um, I never felt secure in my salvation, which is interesting because I came from that Presbyterian background. The once saved, always saved mentality was what my family background was. And for a few years in my life, I even attended a Presbyterian church, very conservative Presbyterian church in America, congregation. So, but in my childhood, I never felt good enough, never felt good enough. And I think when you're in an environment where there's an altar call Sunday morning, and there's an altar call Sunday night, and there's maybe an altar call Wednesday night, and when there's not an actual physical go down to the altar call, there is a silent altar call. Everybody head bowed, eyes closed, raise your hand if God is saying to you this, or if you're struggling with this sin, or so sometimes 3 times a week, I was being reminded that I didn't meet the standard, So I was one of those kids who was at the altar all the time. I mean, it was not abnormal for me to be raising my hand in a silent altar call. It wasn't abnormal for me to be down at the front. And there were times when I even struggled with, I didn't go down to the front. Am I being prideful? Uh-oh, that's a sin. I'm prideful. I'm not humble enough to go down to the front. And so I would go down to the front to repent of being too proud to go down to the front. So, I mean,
Hmm.
it puts you in this trap. I described it once in some of my writing that it's policing yourself. They teach you to police yourself. And I really did. I really did from a very young age police myself.
Hmm. Just
Yeah.
curious, did they ever notice that pattern and question themselves and say, she's clearly struggling with assurance, and we want her to be sure. So, like, let's just sit with her and kind of do like one final big altar call just for her, and be like, are you, do you believe, do you want God, and do you
Right.
believe in the gospel? Do you want to be holy? If that's true of you, then you're fine. Did they try to
Right.
kind of finalize it for you, or did they kind of keep going? Let
I
it keep going?
think no, I don't. The altar calls weren't like personal counseling sessions, generally speaking, unless, for example, someone went forward and specifically asked for prayer of salvation, or someone went forward and specifically asked to be anointed with oil for healing or whatever. The altar calls weren't personal, that the pastor came to you and gave you one-on-one counseling. So I would say the vast majority of the time, a preacher never knew why I was down at the front, but
Gotcha.
I was there.
You mentioned
Yeah.
anointing with oil. They did that in your church?
Yes. A.B. Simpson was actually a Presbyterian minister from Canada. He is the one who started the Christian Missionary Alliance in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He originally started it just as a mission sending organization. It turned into a denomination, but he had started a healing house in New York City where people could go for healing. And so when that fourfold gospel got set up, this is what we as an organization believe, healing became an absolute thing within that fourfold gospel. And so, yes, anointing with oil, um, and prayer services for healing. There might be a couple of times a year a prayer service for healing that was specifically just for healing, but also a preacher might offer, for example, if a congregant was diagnosed with cancer, they might have a special time during a Sunday service to anoint that person with oil. Or if someone went down to the front, most preachers would have oil in the pulpit or oil in their pocket in their jacket. And if someone went down to the front during an altar call and expressed a desire for healing, they would just on the spot anoint them with oil. So yes, that was a regular part of my church experience.
Did you ever see something that they claimed was a miracle? Like they had, so and so had cancer, but now it's gone. So and so whatever was diagnosed with this, and now it looks like it's remission. anything like that where it was like clearly they were pegging it as a miracle of God?
Um, the word miracle was used very carefully. I have to credit them with not being willy-nilly with that word. They were careful and cautious with the word miracle. But yes, there were times when, someone would be told they have cancer and then they go in for the surgery and it turns out, the biopsy proves it's not really cancer, and that would be declared, that God had healed them or whatever. But yes,
Hmm.
that it wasn't super frequent, but I did hear that. Yeah.
It's interesting. I wanted to ask you a couple of quick questions, real short for context, and then get
Uh-huh.
back to your story. But you mentioned your dad's situation, and if
Mhm.
you're going to want to cover this later, that's fine. But my question is going to be, what happened with you at that point where you're moving and so forth with your mom, the
Mhm.
divorce that occurred? Did you stay in touch with him? Did you understand? Was it even explained to you what was going on? And did over the
Oh,
years, did you have a relationship that stayed, in any way in contact?
right. No. So, when we moved, I when I look back on it as an adult, I can kind of see how things played out. I have enough clear memories to see how things played out. During the divorce process, I could tell he kind of hid away, um, at my grandparents' home, and we, saw him there. But then after my mother moved us, we seldom saw him. She would tell me that he wasn't available and didn't want to see us. And she would tell him that, we didn't have time to see him, or the times he wanted to come visit, didn't fit our schedule. She made it appear to him that we were very busy. And I've only learned this as an adult. I didn't know this as a child. So as a child, I thought my father didn't want to see me. And the few times that he did visit us, my mother would be very, very adamant, if he brought up his partner, if he brought presents, he would try to come. And my my father's side of the family gives presents very generously. Presents, just little gifts, and getting together and having big meals together and things like that is normal for them. It's just what they do. So he would bring presents from family, and she would get angry over it. So I mean, there was a very, looking back on it now as an adult, to what happened in my childhood, there was a purposeful estrangement from him to try and keep us away from him. So around age 8 or 9, not too long after the divorce and our move, my sister and I like talked to our dad on the phone one day and just said, we don't want to see you anymore. Because we had, you know, internalized what we'd been told. And that ended that relationship. Really, he did send cards. We did hear from him now and again. Um, but there was no relationship with him until adulthood.
Hmm. So heartbreaking. I want to come back to that because I'm guessing there's more to that story, but I want to
Right.
let you tell it in the right order. What
Right.
with that church and your salvation,
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned that it was real and you were going to, you really felt convicted enough to say,
Mm-hmm.
am I doing this right? Is there pride in my heart? What was it like just with your personal relationship with God, like your quiet time or whatever, your worship? What was it
Right.
like just you and God, not with the church looking, but just you in your quietness?
I think the quietness of my heart was always anxious, always anxious. Part of that, I think, is just my genetics and my personality. Part of that is a lot of the traumas that built up in my childhood, but it was a constant sense of anxiety, which is probably another reason I was at the altar so frequently. What might have been interpreted as holiness or a spiritual drive by the people around me, um, really was a lot of anxiety for me. So there was, when I was very young, um, I did just a lot of praying and a lot of talking, late nights, going to bed, fearful things. By the time I was in junior high, it became more of an actual Bible study, using devotionals, writing in journals. Um, and really getting more in depth than probably the average teenager around me was doing. Yeah.
Was it, I'm just curious, and I don't want to sound like a psychiatrist or whatever, psychologist, but with the, God is described a lot in churches as a father, as a loving father, as the father figure for us in the biggest
Mm-hmm.
sense, our heavenly father, eternal father,
Mm-hmm.
good father, as I think one of the songs says.
Right.
It, did you feel at all like he was, in a sense, your, not just your truest eternal father, but even on earth, like a surrogate father? And that it was like and in that context, two sides to it. Was there a sense of just the warm love, but also was
Mm-hmm.
there any sense of anxiety of either, you're not measuring up and he's not going to like you, or he's going to, in some way, turn his face away from you? Like, how did your heavenly father concept relate to your
Right.
earthly father concept?
I think that my heavenly father concept primarily came from the preaching and teaching I heard so frequently. And I don't, back in the 80s when I was growing up, there was among certain denominations a very strong push towards that end times pre-tribulation rapture, in the thief in the night movies. And so my relationship as far as with a heavenly father was that, yeah, I wasn't measuring up, I wasn't good enough, um, I wasn't quite right enough, and I needed to keep myself in line. Again, that idea of policing yourself to make sure that you're holy enough, or that you're going to get raptured instead of suffer the tribulation, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Hmm. It's interesting. I've got a bit of a parallel. I did an interview myself a few weeks ago and telling my story, and I was talking about a situation where I said I just felt like God was always going to pull the carpet out from under my feet. And the
Right.
guy asked me kind of like, what, did that pass? And I said, honestly, for my personality, I always feel that way. Like, even now,
Right.
I just always feel like the carpet's going to get pulled out and something bad's going to happen. And I sometimes wonder, like, what about the worldview and the theology of the church that sometimes creates that in us, that just feels like, God's going to get us. And I do think that
Mm-hmm.
some of it is related to some of those stories where you're like, you're in Eden where there's no sin yet. It's going to mess up.
Right.
God's eventually going to be so upset
Uh-huh.
he's going to drown everybody. And it's like, when you add all this stuff up, even the good guys, though, remember that story where they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant back, and it looks like it's going to slip, and he puts his hand up. Like, even your best intentions just to
Right.
protect the Ark, God's going to get you for it.
Right.
And I
Right.
sometimes wonder if that plays into some of these, outworkings of our personalities. Do you ever wonder about that?
Oh, I have no doubt. I have no doubt that I might have already been a person who might have tended toward anxiety. But yes, it just compounded. Nothing is ever good enough. You know, nothing is ever good enough, and so, um, again, yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I really believe that those stories and the way the gospel was preached, I think some people in this day and age hear a lot more love, 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 loving Father, loving God. God, back then, that was not what was the common thing that was preached. The common thing that was preached was scare you into going to heaven. That was kind of the goal, it seemed so often, so
Hmm.
often.
Does the CMA preach a literal fiery hell?
Yes, they preach a literal hell. At when in my childhood and during my college and my years in ministry, they preached very much a pre-trib rapture, a dispensationalist view of the world. They kind of backed off of that. Maybe in the early 2000s, they started to allow preachers to have a different perspective, as long as when they were ordained, they could explain that perspective,
Hmm.
and legitimize it through scripture. It could be different. But when I was young, um, it was the literal hell, the literal rapture,
Hmm.
tribulation.
Did you
So,
fear that,
oh
like being
goodness,
left behind?
I feared it all the time. Yeah, I was one of those people who always feared being left behind. Definitely.
Hmm. Did you ever, like, wake up sometime and be like, I think the house sounds a little eerily quiet. It sounds kind of empty. I wonder if it just happened.
Right. Yeah, no, I didn't do that. For so many years of my life, my sister and I slept in the same bed. We almost always slept in the exact same room. So I was never really alone ever. So I didn't have any of those experiences that where I thought, oh, the rapture happened and
Hmm.
everyone's gone but me. Yeah.
One more quick question before you get back to your story. You mentioned a phrase a minute or so ago about never feeling like you were good enough.
Hmm.
One of the things that I think Christians, especially preachers, would latch on to quickly is perfect. Like that's great. Like you get it.
Yes.
You are you are not in a bad spot theologically. You're exactly where you need to
Exactly where
be.
I'm supposed to be.
And that is where your sufficiency is never supposed to be on your own physical works or your
Hmm.
mental holiness is supposed to be we're beggars daily begging for the bread.
Right.
And that
Hmm.
bread is constantly God, or whatever however people phrase it.
Uh-huh.
But like you're not enough, and if you were to think you are enough, you're in a really bad spot, especially if there's any sense
Exactly.
of arrogance or
Exactly.
like. Did you get that sense from them at all? Where if you
Oh, yes.
when talk to people saying, "Perfect, God is your sufficiency."
Right. Yes. That that became something that I really latched onto later in life. And it didn't necessarily end that anxiety of never being good enough, but it did keep me going back and back to the Bible and back to the Bible. I sometimes joke that there are periods of my life where I probably spent more time studying the Bible than the preacher I was listening to on Sunday mornings, because that drive to be good enough and to know enough and to be separate, to be holy was always there. So
Hmm.
yeah.
That's the word separation. I went to Bob Jones for years, so the word separation definitely rings a bell too. Well, what happened
Right.
next in your story?
So after getting saved in childhood, I went through, I'm not going to go into a whole lot about my family, but it was an abusive home environment with my mother. Um, and I was pretty much the primary sole target of that abuse. And so not only was I not good enough at church, and I was not good enough at home, I was not good enough really anywhere in my life. I remember going through all that childhood and just trying to always be, we had jet cadets at the time, which is going to date me a lot for anyone who's listening and knows about those church children's clubs. But we had
Like
jet
Girl
cadets.
Scouts for
Right.
church?
Yes, it's like Girl Scouts for church. You don't really learn or do anything useful, Awanas or Jet Cadets, any groups like that. You just memorize scripture
Yep.
and you memorize whatever is the doctrinal teachings that organization wants to make sure the children have learned. So I went through Jet Cadets, and that was kind of my whole rearing in the faith, was that church environment and Jet Cadets. Then in seventh grade, we moved back to the town where both of my parents had lived and been raised. And during that time, my mother met my stepfather, and he also went to a Christian Missionary Alliance church. He had been discipled when he was in the Navy through the base Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts, Bill Gothard's organization. And so he had some of those materials in the house. He had a very even more conservative perspective on life than my mother. He almost didn't marry my mother because she was a divorced woman. And the pastor basically had to talk him into the fact that, well, her husband is not a believer and they were separated. So, she's free, and to divorce her is not adultery, or to marry her, a divorced woman, is not adultery. And so they got married, and we began attending the church that he went to. And right about that time, for whatever reason, I'm not certain, there were a couple of things going on within our denomination. And one of them was uh, preachers going around and preaching about the coming end times and the coming tribulation, and that the Soviet Union was going to be this force against Israel, and there was going to be Armageddon, and we were all going to die. And coupled with hearing those sermons fairly regularly, so I'm 13, 14 years old, hearing this, they started playing the Thief in the Night series as Sunday evening worship in our church, so we would go in and sit down, and we would have prayer and maybe sing a worship chorus or two, and then we would watch this movie about how and they're horrible movies. They're just absolutely horrible acting, horrible everything. But this notion that if we aren't properly saved and properly following God, and if our faith isn't genuine, we're going to end up not being raptured and being beheaded if we ever do turn to God again. So a lot of this stuff is running through my mind. On top of that, sanctification theme in the Christian Missionary Alliance is that name missionary. So as I said a little while ago, when A.B. Simpson started the denomination, it was actually started as a mission sending organization that any Christian from any denomination could join and be part of, and they trained missionaries and sent them out. So the Christian and Missionary Alliance as a denomination still has that focus. And every year, at least once, in some congregations twice, so it would be once in the fall and once in the spring, a whole week is set aside. Like some churches might have a revival or something like that. In the South, they might have homecoming. But in the Christian and Missionary Alliance, they had a missions conference. And missionaries would go from church to church, and it's a requirement. They have to. They can't work at a job when they come home from the field for a year break. They have to go church to church to support the denomination and to raise money. And so missionaries would come, and we would be at church Sunday morning, Sunday night, every night of the week, usually Saturday, a big conference, a celebration, lots of people dressing up, lots of cultural appropriation, and people, every service would be followed by an altar call. And the altar call was always, are you willing to serve the Lord in missions? Are you willing to give up your earthly dream and follow the Lord? Are you willing to set aside your worldly desires and your career? Are you willing to be the one? And that would happen at least 1 week out of the year, every night, these impassioned altar calls. In my particular church, it was frequently 2 weeks out of the year. And then there would also be that constant presence of missions call in youth events. So during youth events, you might have a weekend where you got together with 3 or 4 other youth groups, or your whole district did something, or your church did something, and you went away to a camp, and you'd have Bible studies, and it's fairly typical conference type stuff. But there would always be those mission services with that altar call. Let's serve the Lord. You be the one to sacrifice, and lots of Keith Green music playing, that kind of thing. So I
can definitely relate to this part of your story. This is right. Very ringing a lot of bells.
Right. So I can remember the fear coupled with that desire to please the Lord. I wouldn't say my faith was works-based. I can see some people maybe accusing me of that. It wasn't works-based. It was, I want to make God happy. I want to please my Heavenly Father. I know I'm not good enough. So let's see how I can please him. And always that feeling that whatever I wanted must not be right. The heart is deceitful. Your desires are deceitful. Those concepts were always there. And so I think it wasn't at all surprising that I was down at that altar during those mission calls. Every 3 years in the Christian Missionary Alliance, they have an event called Life. And during Life, all the youth from the entire country come together in one location, usually a big university campus, and they have a conference, they have adventure trips, they have special worship leaders, they have music artists come in, and anything you can imagine that youth would want to do is at these events. And so are all of the college campuses for the denomination. So it's really a giant recruiting option, so that everywhere you go, these representatives are there from the colleges, and they're telling you how what you want to do with your life can be used to serve the Lord, and you should come here to our school. So the year I went to Life was 1989. It was held in Colorado Springs. The denomination was picking up and moving there. Focus on the Family had gone there. Navigators was there. Colorado Springs was like this little hub of godliness, in the Rocky Mountains, and everyone was going to Colorado Springs. And so they took us to Colorado Springs. We stayed at CSU campus there. And that is where I gave myself to be a missionary. And I look back on that and think of the emotion and manipulation that's ginned up. Like in my youth group, I think 40 or 50 of us went. I was from a big church. It was a large congregation, but 40 or 50 of us went to Colorado Springs that year for Life. And probably 15, 20 of us went forward when they asked people to serve the Lord as missionaries or in ministry. And only 2 of us ever followed through on it. So, I mean, there's that manipulation aspect where this youthful vibrance and wanting to do something, and that peer pressure, and it just all comes together. And that is where I decided I'm going to be a missionary. The problem was, I also loved to write, and I was really starting to kind of put myself out there in school, and I'm kind of a person who's more oriented toward social justice. I have been my whole life, and social justice isn't really highly valued in the church. In the conservative, I should say, in the conservative wings of evangelicalism and fundamentalism, social justice is not valued. So the fact that I was concerned about the oppressed, and I was concerned about equality and things, I had to kind of tamp that down and kind of hide it. It's one of those things I policed myself on, to make sure that wouldn't come out too much. So that would have been what I thought of as more sinful part of my personality that I had to get rid of. So in 89, I went to this conference, and actually my former husband, my ex-husband, also went to that same conference and gave himself to be a missionary at that same conference. We didn't know each other. He was from another district completely in another part of the country. And we didn't meet for another 4 years. It was 4 years later that we met. So, but we were both there, and we both did the same thing there. And while we were there, our youth group got to know our district youth leader. And the reason we got to know him was because he was a real creep.
Oh, no.
I say that very carefully. He was a real creep, and he would show up in the girls' wing of the dorm at night as we were getting ready for bed. Now, we had female leaders. We had grown adult women who were there as our sponsors. They were maybe letting us break curfew a little. They were letting us do things maybe after hours that we shouldn't have done, but none of us were being bad. Nothing illegal was going on. We weren't sneaking out at night. We were just awake. And this man would show up and just walk into our hall unannounced. And one night when I was taking a shower, and there were other girls in the bathroom, there was a bunch of us. There's probably 10, 12 of us in the bathroom at the time. People were taking showers and brushing their teeth. He just came in. And he announced himself and he told us we were breaking curfew, but he also kind of just stood in there and chatted with us. And I can remember being in the shower and just being really freaked out that this guy was in there and very uncomfortable and wondering why. And finally he left. And from that point on, I just was very, very put off by him. I couldn't really tolerate to be near him. And it wasn't maybe 5 or 6 months later that our denomination in our district was helping our church find a new youth pastor. And he was the district youth leader, and we were probably the second biggest church. The only church bigger than ours was one in Pittsburgh, right smack dab in the middle of the city. So we had a big congregation. We had a youth center before having a youth center was a thing, and our church wanted him as the leader. They brought him in to candidate. That's what you call when the pastor in that denomination goes to a church and interviews and preaches. They're the candidate. So they brought him in as the candidate. And when they brought him in, myself and a couple of other girls went to the elders. We said, not a good guy. We don't want to be around him. And they said, why? And we're like, well, this happened. And they're like, oh, well, that's not good. And they went and talked to him, and he gave an excuse for why it happened and promised it wouldn't happen again. And they came back and talked to us and said, he's apologized. This isn't going to happen again. And now you guys don't ever talk about this again. This is not something you discuss. This is the past, and we're moving into the present. And so he
sounds
came.
familiar though to what we're seeing these days in the news.
Right. So he came and he became our youth pastor. And really almost immediately, it was very, very quickly, he started doing the same types of things that he would do. So it was, I believe it was our New Year's Eve all-nighter. We always had an all-night New Year's Eve party. So this would have been 89 going into 90. And our youth center had bathrooms that had lockers and showers in them. And so a bunch of us girls were in there, and we were brushing teeth and doing our hair. I mean, we had our Aquanet. This is this is the 80s, the big bangs and huge hair. And so we were in there being teenage girls, and in he walks. And I thought, oh my, there he is. Same thing he did in Colorado, and then stuff like that started to happen regularly. So I'm dealing with some real cognitive dissonance because I'm dealing with this creepy, awful, genuinely awful man who is just, at this point, I'm recognizing is a flat out liar. And I'm dealing with this holiness altar call. I've got to stay right with the Lord. I've got to keep my heart pure. I've got to do the right thing. I've got to be a person who tells the truth. And I'm going back and forth. And I was so torn. I was so torn in dealing with him. But I had made a promise to the elders to not say anything. And so as these creepy behaviors ramped up, he started to do something that originally I didn't pick up on. Now as an adult, I can see was grooming behavior. But as a teenager, I had no idea what it was. He started to plan these little youth events that were totally not something a guy would do. It would be to go to a concert for an artist that a guy would never sit and listen to, or if he did, he would never admit that to his buddies. It was to go to a special prayer meeting event or something like that. These were just things that were very focused on what a teenage girl might be interested in. And there were very few of us who would go. There was just like a handful of girls who were kind of the more spiritual, mature leaders who would maybe want to go. And he would say, oh, we don't have a big crowd. I'll drive you in my car. We don't have to take the church van. We don't need all these sponsors, And I think we did two events like that. And And then there was a third one. And I had already been used to it by that point, go to his place and meet at his house and then get in his car and go somewhere. And this time I went to his house and I knocked on the door, and he answered in his bathrobe, and he had a mullet and his hair was just dripping down and his robe was like clinging to him. And I mean, he was just in a bathrobe. And he's like, come on in. And, I was just kind of stunned. And I just like followed him into the house. I noticed out of the corner of my eye in his living room, this was his parsonage that was owned by the church, but in the living room was another girl in the youth group. She was the same age as me, and she was sitting in a chair by herself, but she had obviously been there for a little bit while he must have been showering. And he's like, come on down here. And I look at this now and I'm like, I think he was trying to throw me a little bit, kind of shock me a little bit. And I just followed him just dumbly, just blindly went down the hall after him, and he stopped and went into a room, and I just stood there. And that's when it started to click with me. His wife's not here. His kids aren't here. We're alone back here, and this man's in a bathrobe. And when I look up, I'm standing in the doorway of his bedroom, and he's starting to pull stuff out of his closet and asking me what he should wear, what would look best on him. And it was just a very, very wrong thing. And I knew that. And I kind of froze. That flight or fight instinct kicked in, and I just took off back down the hall. I feel like I was running. I probably wasn't, but my heart rate was up, and that instinct. So I went down the hall and sat in the living room just in complete silence with this girl. We did not talk to each other. We did not say a word. I don't know what happened before I got there. She probably doesn't know what happened back in the hallway. We just sat there very quietly. And after that point, we went to the event that night. We went to church, and I must have been acting oddly because other friends would be talking to me. Around the same time, he started to just be mean to his wife. I mean, just openly mean to his wife in front of the youth. And there was a couple of the teen girls that he would just mock and make fun of. And so we started talking. There was just a couple of us. And I finally told them what happened to me. And they're like, oh, we got to do something about this, and I'm like, so we debated, how do we handle it? Because we'd been told not to say anything. We'd been told we can't bring up the past. And in that whole process, we decided we'll go to him, and we'll obey what the book of Matthew says. You go to the offender and you tell them and you ask them, and if they won't deal with you, and then you take witnesses and you go to them again. And I mean, we were literally teenage girls following the instruction of Scripture. And of course, he did not accept what we had to say. He denied things. He pretended nothing had happened. And he really just had this mentality of, you're going to be quiet and you're not going to say anything. So after trying to talk to him and it not working, and that's really not surprising, but to me at that time in my life, I was super naive. And I thought, oh, when you do things what the Bible says, when you act on what the Bible tells you to act on, well, then it's going to work out for you, because that's what you're told in the church. So I was discussing with my mother some of this stuff at home. And initially, she just wanted me to stop talking about it and be quiet. And looking back on it, I'm realizing that there was some trauma there, and I was trying to deal with it, but didn't have a real healthy way to deal with it. So I just was talking to her. And finally she said, let's talk to the senior pastor. So she called the senior pastor and said, we got some issues going on here, and would it be possible to have a meeting? And he said, sure, let's have a meeting and discuss this with him. And he said, I'll get back to you and let you know when. And a few days later, he called back and he said, meet us, Sunday evening after the service. We'll have a meeting and we'll discuss and we'll get to the bottom of things. And I, honest to goodnessly, I thought with all my heart that meant the senior pastor, the youth pastor, myself, one or two other girls, our parents, if they wanted, we would discuss what had gone on and we'd get something resolved. I really, really genuinely believed that. And then I started hearing some things at school from other students who went to our church. And there would be comments, a lot from guys in the youth group. They would just flat out say, why are you trying to take down the youth pastor? What are you trying to do? And and I always thought, what do you mean? And then I thought, how do you even know? How do you know what's going on? So that kind of set me a little on edge. The night that the meeting was supposed to take place, my family met with another girl and her family, and then one other girl. Some of the parents had said, we don't want our daughters involved in this. They didn't want mess. They didn't want to deal with fallout. They didn't want to be bringing an accusation against the leader of the church. 1 Timothy 5:19, don't even entertain an accusation against the leader unless there's witnesses, So we walked into this room, and I should have known when they said, meet us in the youth center, that it wasn't going to be a small group of people. But we walked into the youth center, and at the front of the youth center, where the podium usually is, was just a whole array of people. On one side of the room was nearly the entire elder board, so 9-10 men. Then there was the senior pastor sitting there in his suit with his big Bible in his lap, and there was the youth pastor with his wife, and she had a Bible in her lap, and they were holding hands. And then there was a group of parents that had nothing to do with any of it, whose children had not been affected, who were just sitting over on the side in the wings. And they asked us to say what we were upset about and to tell what had gone on. And then essentially, every time we spoke, they rebuked us. They denied. The youth pastor plainly lied, repeatedly lied. The parents said, well, our kids have told us that none of this stuff happened. The elders would come at us with being young girls in the church attacking a man of God, and the wife denied. I mean, it was just this huge display of authority against the people who'd been harmed, which again, I was naive then. I now know this is normal procedure in churches. This is not an abnormal thing. It happens all the time, but I was very young and very innocent, and honestly believed that God would move and the truth would be known and things would come out good, and it didn't. After that, it was almost as if my family was shunned from the church. And I do know for a fact, because my mother has told me on multiple occasions, that she blames me for our family being shunned from that church. We would walk in the doors and people would quite literally turn away from us, like not even greet us. I know it happened to another of the girls' families. Their family left the church. Our family left the church. And we began attending a very different congregation, which was my grandparents' congregation, the Presbyterian Church in America congregation. And I immediately went from this rapture is going to happen, dispensationalist holiness, get sanctified, altar call movement, to a very traditional sing hymns, have responsive readings, read from a psalter. And our Sunday school class for the juniors and seniors was R.C. Sproul's Ligonier Ministries videos that we would watch, and then very strong discussions in the doctrine and the tulip and things like that. So I had a complete flip. This church environment, so I was harmed, and then I was shunned, and then I completely changed directions as far as doctrine and style and methodology of the church I was in. In light of everything, I stayed totally dedicated. I was still the student who was doing her daily devotional reading, who was studying the Bible, who was attending the school club prayer meetings, who was going to youth group every week. I mean, I didn't falter. I stayed on track completely in my faith, and just kind of switched viewpoints and perspectives on theology.
That is like just the last 10 or 15 minutes of your story. It's so much trauma and so much distortion so fast. It was like almost like in a concentrated sense. It's hard to wrap my mind around. And especially the way that they wouldn't, really respect your story and give you credence that this could have been exactly what happened. And putting you on the spot like that, like, it should, I would think even in a church, but for sure in a healthy environment, like have a very small group of people that investigates it and expands it out. To feel like you're in a kangaroo court from day one is it's just crazy. That's
right.
But yet it's very like with what we're hearing with the the shiny happy people thing that just came out on Amazon and the other stories. It's like this, like you're saying, this is not that abnormal in the big picture of all these stories.
No, it's really not. It's really not. The more time you spend in the church, the more in depth you are, the more behind the scenes, the more you interact with leadership, the more you realize that this is a completely normal thing. It's a completely normal thing that happens very often. It doesn't always necessarily happen in such a big group kind of organized manner, but it does happen quietly in pastoral studies and just with one or two staff members or something like that, regularly.
It's fascinating too, a couple of concepts I think your story brings up. Number one is the whole idea of you don't question the leadership. I mean, obviously if there's like an extreme situation, but like in general, 99% of the time you should not be questioning your leaders. They're there by God's choice, and they're to be respected and honored. And just that immunity, that you have the standard immunity. If you're a church leader, and especially a pastor,
you do.
That you can really get away with a lot of stuff.
You can, absolutely.
I've heard it so many times. The other thing is the idea, you didn't per se say this, but it kind of came through, the idea of like, let's pursue the unity of the church. Like, let's just keep ourselves all together. That's not, no feathers being ruffled. And it's like, but that requires a great amount of like burying your head in the sand for that to happen.
It does.
And eventually
it really does.
It's going to just blow up in your face because some of those stories are going to eventually get told and people realize we didn't protect people that needed protection.
Right. Right.
Did your mom believe you the whole time?
I
know you said at one point she was saying you were the cause of them having to move on, but was she still believer in the technicalities of what happened?
Yes, she continued to blame me. She did believe what had happened. She didn't think I was lying about what had happened, but she did blame me for just not letting it go. She just wanted me to let it go. And because I hadn't let it go. And again, that's kind of that social justice stuff kicking up in my insides, she doesn't like that part of me at all. No, she still doesn't like that part of me at all.
Well, I definitely want to revisit that part of your family dynamic in a few minutes. Can I ask, do you think the theology of forgiveness caused some of this in the sense of like, if God forgave this much, how can you not forgive that much? Like, does that play into this?
And that plays into my entire life. As I get further into my story, you'll see that you are filthy rags and God still accepts you and forgives you. You have to accept and forgive this person and move on. I think one of the most dangerous things in the church in America is that very strong doctrine of forgiveness. And that's going to come across as a horrible thing for a person to say, but I really believe it's one of the worst aspects of the church because it is the tool it constantly uses to oppress people who've been harmed. They use forgiveness to harm people again, and to harm people again, and to harm people again. And so I think that is one of the most dangerous things in the church, in my opinion.
You mentioned there's more to your story where these themes keep coming up. What did happen next in your story?
So I really stuck with my faith, and I stuck with that call to missions. There was a point in time when I considered going into communications. I was editing my school newspaper, and the teacher that sponsored that and taught the journalism class wanted me to go into communications. She really pushed it. She really encouraged it. She was very discouraged when my grandmother and mother kind of conspired to pay for my first semester of school if I attended the Christian college rather than go to a state university. And I didn't really understand the difference in how much a public institution would cost versus how much a state institution would cost. I really didn't get the concept at all. And so I thought, oh, if she's going to pay my first semester, then I'll definitely go to the Christian school. And so at that point, I actually had applied long ago to the Christian Missionary Alliance school, even before my family left that church. So I stayed on track with that. And even though I wasn't going to Christian Missionary Alliance church, when I graduated college, I went to the Christian Missionary Alliance school, Toccoa Falls College in Georgia. And I became a missiology major. So I'm going to stay on track and be the missionary. That 1 year, my freshman year, was really fun. I had independence from my home. I had independence from that past. The past was gone. I was far away. I was 12 hours away from all that mess, and I didn't have to think about it. And I really loved it. And I was still this completely pure, innocent. I hadn't dated anyone. I hadn't kissed a boy. I was still fully focused on, when I wasn't studying, a vast majority of which was theology and Bible classes, I was still studying personally my Bible, going to all the prayer meetings, going to all the special services, never missed a chapel. I mean, I was the good girl. I was always the good girl on campus, kind of thing. And my sophomore year, I had been interested in this guy. He's a little bit older than me, but he was a really nice guy, really shy guy, very slow moving and very quiet. But I then ended up meeting through being put on a traveling team. Some people might not be familiar with this concept in college. In Christian colleges, it happens real frequent. They will have traveling groups of students who maybe play as a worship team or sing as a group or do drama, and they go from church to church to church, and they're kind of spokespeople for the college, and they recruit new students. And so I got set up on one of these teams in the drama part of the team, and my future husband got voluntold to be on the team because they needed a guy, and he was kind of this big man on campus. He's the soccer goalie. He was 6'5" and just athletic and charming and really extroverted. And he got voluntold because they thought he would be a great addition. So he ended up on the team too. And so here is innocent good girl me and the big man on campus. And we ended up on the team together. And it was a really quick process to where he had kind of finagled his way into me assisting him in leading the drama team. And he just said one night, hey, let's meet. And if I give you some notes, will you type it up? And then we can, present this to our leader as this is how we're going to proceed with the drama stuff. And I said, okay, sure. And so he said, let's meet in the chapel. So I thought, this is just totally benign. I really had no inklings. I was dressed down in sweats. I didn't have makeup on. I had my hair in a ponytail. I just was casually going about my day. I walked over to the chapel with a notebook, and it was locked. And he met me there and said, oh, shoot, the chapel's locked. You know what? Let's go to the Dairy Queen. And so I said, okay. And he drove me into town. We ended up at the Dairy Queen. And he said, I didn't really want to meet with you to discuss the stuff on the team. I just thought if I asked you out on a date, you wouldn't say yes. And so our very first date, it was actually a trick. And um, little innocent, had never dated anyone, me was very flattered that big man on campus was interested in her. And so we started dating that year, almost regularly, almost immediately, within weeks. When we were having a date where we walked through the local cemetery, which for people in a small town Christian college campus isn't that abnormal of a date. So we went and we walked through the cemetery, and he told me that night that he had broken up with his high school sweetheart the year before because she wasn't called to missions and wasn't going to serve God overseas. And that he had promised and vowed before God to never date another girl until it was the girl he was going to marry. And that God had showed him that I was that girl. And some people would probably immediately see that as a red flag and be like, no, but I didn't, because purity culture wasn't a term people used back then. We didn't talk about purity culture, but the concept was flowing through everything we did. And here I was, I had never dated, and I had never held hands. Well, I can't say that. I held hands with a guy once for like 5 minutes in a youth group bus trip, and that wasn't really dating. It's just, I had never done anything. And here I was, the big man on campus who was also called to go into missions, had been told by God that I was the one. And 5 weeks after we started dating, that first time he tricked me into going out with him, he took me home to meet his family on Thanksgiving, and he told his parents, she's the one I'm going to marry. And they were like, no, 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 there's this other girl, that family friend who's also going to be a missionary. She's the one. And he was like, nope, this one is. So within 5 weeks of meeting this guy, I was emotionally engaged to him. No ring on my finger, but it was going to happen. And after that point, I think when he realized he had me and I was all in, a couple of things happened. Number one, I started seeing that every Bible verse I read was a confirmation of what was happening in my life. And so I could read a proverb and read it as a confirmation that this is the man I'm going to marry, And I look back on that now and I think, oh my goodness, I was a 19-year-old, absolutely innocent, who hadn't experienced anything. And here I am determining all these things about my life through scripture. And he would push the buttons. He would test me. He would not show up for a date. He would not call me when he would say he's going to call me. He would go a day without talking to me. And then he would come back to me. And if I was upset, he'd be like, oh, you're just so sensitive. No, it's okay. I'm all yours. God gave you to me and we're going to serve the Lord. And I'd catch him having a long, quiet conversation with the ex-girlfriend, and he'd come back, oh, don't worry. It's just that God has made us for each other. During that time, he also began to push physical boundaries. And I won't go into great detail on that, but just to say that by the time the engagement ring was on my finger, I felt like I was too dirty to be any other man's woman. I mean, it was just, even though we didn't have sex, I had so much of that purity culture talk in me that I felt like this was the only man I could now be with, because we just gone too far. And so we were engaged. We started dating in October of 93. We were engaged in May of 94. I went overseas to Morocco and did my ethnography internship for my degree, and came back that fall So we spent the fall on campus engaged, and we got married in December of 1994.
Hmm.
And
Can I ask, with that process, did you feel though, like
mm-hmm,
you mentioned you saw Proverbs, that this was your life,
mm-hmm.
and did you feel a sense that God was, as they say, restoring the years the locusts had eaten by giving you this husband, or like how much was your level of peace at that point?
Um, my level of peace, I had fully, and I really believe this now, I had fully convinced myself that this was God's will. And yes, that God was giving me this great gift of never having dated and never having defiled myself and never having, never having to say that there were other people out there. There was just this guy, and he was the one for me. And I really felt like that was a gift from God. I really did feel like, in part, that God was rescuing me out of my past. Yes, very much so. As a matter of fact, one thing that my husband would say to me in the early years of our marriage, whenever we went to visit my family, we would get back in the car, and he would say, he'd put his hand on mine and say, "I'm so glad you're mine," and we get to have this journey together. Kind of reassuring me that the discomfort I had in my own house um, was not what I had to live with forever. But
Hmm.
right from our honeymoon, I knew. One night on our honeymoon, we had stayed in a cabin in the mountains of North Carolina, and as a gift to the people who owned the cabin, he decided he was going to split a bunch of wood for them, for their wood burning stove at the cabin. And he had been outside splitting wood for a couple of hours. I had been cooking dinner. I called him and said, "Hey, dinner's ready. You want to come in?" He didn't come. And I called him again, and he didn't come. And 5 minutes later, I called him again, and he didn't come. I mean, this is like steaks, and we didn't drink alcohol because we were good Christian college students. So there was this, non-alcoholic bubbly beverage, and there was, baked potatoes with sour cream. It had been a nice meal, and it was sitting there cold. And he walked in the door and he said, "You will not tell me what to do." And that was the moment I think I realized that, uh-oh, what is this marriage going to be like?
Wow.
And it just made it very clear to me that even on our honeymoon, I was his, he wasn't mine. I was there for him, he wasn't there for me. Um, and that became a theme pretty much through our entire marriage. But I stayed the course. I write in my blog that I was a huge Elizabeth Elliot fan. I listened to Elizabeth Elliot's radio show every chance I got. Our particular station that our college broadcast played it twice a day. So I'd get it in the morning and I'd get it before bed at night. I mean, I was constantly listening to this dogma coming from Elizabeth Elliot and Focus on the Family and other groups of the wifely submission. If you submit yourself, your husband will love you. If you submit yourself, God will protect you. God protects the woman who submits. That's how it works. And as long as you submit, everything's going to work out fine. So
Hmm.
it didn't matter how he behaved. I would submit, and then submit more again, and then submit more again, and that became the running theme for our life together.
It seems
We
like in
went
those,
through college.
sorry, good.
Go ahead.
It seems like in some of those dynamics, there's almost like not just like you can get through this, but it's almost like a badge of honor to go through
Oh my
something abusive,
goodness.
because it's like it's proof that you're willing to lay it all in the hands of Jesus. Let him,
Right.
like he will, if somebody's truly being abusive, it's like, yeah, they are going to be judged. It's not by you. Let God is the one who takes
Mm-hmm,
vengeance. I will repay.
mm-hmm,
Let him repay it all. And also the sense of following in the footsteps of Jesus, is saying Jesus had, whatever, a million angels at his beck and call.
uh-huh.
He could have called them down at a moment, but he
Right.
simply relinquished his
Exactly.
rights. Philippians 2, he laid down his rights.
Mm-hmm,
He emptied himself and let himself be horribly abused. And it's like, if that's your
right.
mentor, your model, your hero, why would you not also go through a little bit to follow in his footsteps? Because abuse is
Oh.
part of, and also just the idea of, in the world in general, you're going to be abused because you're a Christian. The world's not, going to respect your
Mm-hmm,
worldview.
yep.
But even in a marriage. And when you mix that, I mean, there's like several pieces of the puzzle, but when you mix that dynamic of like, let God do the vengeance, follow in Jesus's footsteps
Right.
of being willing to be abused, then you add
Right.
in the patriarchy and the submission, and just also just this sense of like, God doesn't settle all of his debts today,
Right.
but he will fix it.
He
Just
will. He
be
will.
patient, let him have time. And when you look back at this in 10 years, you'll be like that tapestry, that example we all heard in church a lot, of like, on the one side it's
Uh-huh.
all these strings that don't make sense, you flip it, it's like, oh, it's so beautiful.
It's a beautiful day.
And it's like,
Uh-huh.
it's, you mix those things together and probably a few more big ideas, and especially with certain personalities that might be more willing to be quiet and be passive.
Mhm.
It's like toxicity on steroids for the people
It
that are the
is.
victims.
It is. And I wore that badge of honor. I really honestly did. Not out loud to people, but inside. I knew, okay, I'm one of God's servants, and I am serving him, and he's allowing me to suffer, and it's okay. I can handle this. And another aspect that kind of builds on what you were just saying, that I felt internally but didn't necessarily voice openly to people, was that if I can handle this, if I can suffer this, then you can stick it out. And I lost mercy and care for other women who were going through stuff, because my marriage became a horror story. And I thought, as I looked out at other women, if I can endure what I'm enduring, you can too. If I can still turn around and forgive and serve my husband, if I can still praise him, if I can still tell my children to honor him, if I can do all these things, you can too. Stop complaining, you know? And I became very hard-hearted towards myself and toward others, which it really blocks off the ability to receive healing, or to hear from people who might be able to speak to you and say, it's not okay. And it was 20 plus years into my marriage before I could sit and listen to someone and they could hear what I had to say and go, you do realize that's not okay. And that I could say, yeah, that wasn't okay. Yeah, it takes a lot. That system, that dogma, um, really creates an environment where abuse, outright abuse, and even more subtle forms of control and manipulation just run rampant. It just runs rampant.
Did you have any sense of giving yourself permission to talk to anybody throughout that process, or was it more just like, just keep this inside, it's between you and God?
It was always only between me and God. I
Hmm.
never described what my marriage was like to a living soul until my ex-husband left me in 2016.
Hmm.
So from 1997, or I'm sorry, gosh, 1997 is when my son was born. From 1994, when we married, until 2016, when he left me, I never told a living soul what my marriage was like.
Hmm.
It was just me and God and a lot of journals. That was it.
And is it correct you all went into some kind of ministry together or pastorate?
We did. After we graduated from Toccoa Falls, he graduated a year before me. We went into ministry in Chicago. We actually lived just down the road from Bill Gothard's organization. I could walk there. I did walk there on occasion.
Hmm.
Um, One of the people who came to visit my son when he was born in the church was one of our youth sponsors, who was part of one of Gothard's youth working on the campus there at IBLP. And we were really immersed in that. That ministry did not work out. That church had a lot of internal problems before we got there. And we stepped away from ministry. We moved actually in with my family, which was a whole bad decision on another scale. So after moving in with my family, I realized that was a big mistake pretty quickly. And we began looking for another place to live and struggled to find a place we could afford to rent. I had another baby really rapidly. And then we had been attending that church I grew up in, that same Christian Missionary Alliance church with that scandal that I had left. when I was in high school. And because we were mission candidates within that denomination, and he had been a minister within that denomination, we continued to go to that same church. So it kind of hurt me a little to be there, but at the same time, I felt like this is what God wants. I'm going to be here. I'm going to follow his will. I'm going to do what needs to be done to get us overseas, because you had to serve a certain period in a church over in the States before you could go overseas. About 1 year into us being there, the church hired him, and they kind of designed a position for him. And not too long after he entered that position, he started to have an affair with his secretary. I did not know initially what was going on. About what I might guess would be 9 months into their relationship, I figured it out. I caught them, but not in the act of anything. She had come to our house when I had gone out to get groceries. And when I came back, she was there. And it was displayed as as it often is with preachers, it was displayed as he was helping her through marital problems. She was in a very bad marriage, and he was giving her counsel, and something bad had happened. And they kind of conspired together, went before the pastor and an elder and said, we want to confess to an emotional affair. We want to get this out there. We want to confess. We want to be clean of it. And they kind of went on with this idea that they'd never really done anything. It was just emotional. And of course, I forgave. And I continued in the process, and I continued to submit, and I continued to be that stay-at-home, quiet wife. I was slowly but surely tamping myself way down to where I was a nothing. And he went through the ordination process, and we were commissioned to go overseas in 2002 in the summer. We spent a summer intensive course at Wheaton in suburban Chicago, and that was in sociolinguistics. And then from there, we went to Mongolia. And in serving the Lord in Mongolia, I felt like I finally reached the dream. You know, this is the pinnacle. This is the thing I've been waiting for since 1989, when I went forward at that big youth function. And I gave my life to the Lord, and I put aside all my worldly desires. And now I'm doing that thing, and I'm serving the Lord. We both became very good in the language. He became so good in the language that people, if he called on the phone, people couldn't tell he was an American. They thought he was a Mongolian. He had a really strong skill in language study, pronunciation, just naturally got the groove of it. I was good, but not to his level by any means. And we went on a camping trip during that time, about just over a year after moving there. We went out to the countryside to stay in a ger, to ride horses. And while we were there, he put our 3-year-old on the back of a horse to do a pony ride. And in the process of walking the horse away from the camp, it spooked. She fell off, got dragged with her foot stuck in the stirrup, and got dragged probably 50 yards. And then the horse dropped her. So she suffered injuries. She suffered a broken arm. That was a very bad break. We took her to the emergency hospital. We took her to a Korean emergency clinic that had some higher level equipment. And the doctor said, if you want to be cautious, because she was so young, and the particular break was a break that can cause crippling in a child's arm. And he said, you probably want to go to Hong Kong, or you probably want to go back to the States and just have someone look at this and make sure she doesn't need surgery to correct the issue, to make sure the break isn't on the growth plate. And so we agreed that I would take her. And so we got some plane tickets. They put her in a temporary cast. They tried to set the bone as appropriately as possible, and put her in a temporary cast. We got some plane tickets. We arranged the bank funds, so that I could have money to fly back to the States. And the day before I flew, my husband went out to the State Department store and he bought me two things. He bought me a travel alarm clock so that I was going to stay overnight in Seoul Incheon Airport's little interior hotel. And so that I could get up and get my flight time right, he bought me this little alarm clock, and he bought me a nice stroller so that I would have something to push her through all these big airports in. And then he took me to the airport and dropped me off. Unbeknownst to me, he had picked up the alarm clock. He met a young woman who asked him if he was an English teacher. And he told her yes. He was an English teacher. That's not his job. That wasn't his job with the organization. But she was attractive. And when he left me at the airport, I later found out in his confession that he went straight from the airport and dropping me off back to the State Department store, arranged for this girl to meet him at our apartment so he could start instructing her in English. And while I was home in the States with our daughter, he had started his second affair in Mongolia. And even just talking to him on the phone once a week for 10 minutes, I could tell something was very off with our relationship and with him. During that time, I learned years later he had been locking our 5-year-old and our 6-year-old alone in our apartment at night, and when he would go out with this woman. And so he was creating trauma for them too, and I didn't know this. My son, who was the older one, would try to force himself to stay awake and have nightmares and stuff. So while I'm back in the States dealing with all the medical problems, my husband was in Mongolia having this affair and repeatedly traumatizing our children. And when I got back to Mongolia about 6 weeks later with our daughter and everything was sure her arm had healed in a proper manner, the church had called it a miracle. That's one of the only times I heard my church use the term miracle. They had called it a miracle because the doctors who didn't have the right equipment in Mongolia had miraculously gotten the bone set correctly enough that it wouldn't cause a deformity. So we had finished up with all the complications, and I had flown back to Mongolia, and my husband didn't come to meet me. He let me come off the plane. He let me walk through the crowd. He stood at a door almost outside the airport, like right at the entry to coming in the airport. And he just stood there with his arms crossed, this very angry scowl on his face, glaring at me. And that's pretty much how our relationship stayed for the next almost year until a few more events happened, including he was taking some of our own funds and some of the church's money that the church had saved, and he was taking it to the bank to deposit it for safekeeping, and he lost the money. Is the safety pouch around his neck must have fallen off in a taxi, and so there was a big to-do about that. He called and confessed it to leadership. Anytime he got into trouble, he would call and confess something milder than what he was really doing to the leadership, so that he appeared to be a penitent and humble man, so all these things that would go on, there was always some way he would go to leadership in it, and so that he would appear so good and so right. About a year after my daughter's arm was broken, he contracted an STD from a prostitute, and I figured it out. And we had this service. Some missionaries were coming to evangelize, and we were working with a bunch of university students at the time. I was running the guest house for the organization, and he was kind of the pastor or the youth leader for this university students group. And we had this person come from the States who was doing some evangelism, and they preached a sermon, and they preached a hellfire and brimstone altar call sermon in English, and someone translated it into Mongolian. And that night, I woke up at like 2 a.m. and he was just sitting on our bed staring out the window. And he said, "I've got to tell you something." And he confessed the affair in the States. He confessed the affair. Well, I had been in the States with my daughter's medical issues. He confessed prostitutes. He confessed that the money that he had lost, he had really paid off the mistresses with. And it was that dream, that sacrifice, that submission, all these things that I had done in obedience to God and to please my Heavenly Father and to honor this church I had been a part of. Again, it just blew up and it was gone. And that led into the next big church scandal that I was part of. So after he confessed to me, he called the next day our leader, who was at one point Vietnamese refugee who'd become a doctor, and he was serving in the missions arm of our denomination with us in Mongolia. And my husband confessed to him, and the doctor said, "Well, the vice president and the leader of the relief and development arm are coming this way anyway, so let's set up some meetings." And so when they arrived, my husband confessed to them. And during all these confessions, I quite literally sat beside him and just sat there and quietly, sometimes through tears, submitted, listened. And when I was asked, "Will you stay with him?" I said yes. And and every time, "Will you stay with him?" Yes. "Will you stay with him?" Yes. Because there's this concept in the church that if a husband, doesn't matter what they've done, or a wife, this could also be the wife, but it doesn't matter what your spouse has done, if they say they're sorry, then you owe it to them to give them another chance. And because God gives you so many chances, you owe them so many more chances, And so I had fully taken on that role and decided, no matter what this guy does, I'm staying. No matter what he does, I'm going to hold this family intact. And I just went into survival mode. We ended up back in the States, and this is where the cover-up part comes in. They put us in a very large church in Wisconsin. It's a rural area of Wisconsin, but the church had been very successful and had a good-sized congregation and good ministries, good income, multiple pastors. And they put us there, and a couple of the elders knew the truth, and the pastoral team knew the truth. But they were the only people in the church who knew the truth. Everyone else had been told that our family had been through difficulties and needed time to heal. And it was made to sound very benign. And everyone was encouraged to be very merciful to us. And the church just piled on with love and affection and gifts and money and household items and offers of jobs. And it was just this huge and constant presence of the church doing so much and the people giving so much. And at the same time, I was living with this guilt, because we were there because of scandal. We were there because of actual crime that hadn't, the theft hadn't been reported to the Mongolian authorities. Some of the money taken belonged to Mongolian people in a Mongolian church, and it was not reported to authorities. Everything was just kind of hidden. And we had this big meeting, a meeting I did not want to attend, but ended up in anyway, was guilted and manipulated into attending. And during that meeting, he confessed everything. A denominational vice president listened, wrote notes, asked questions. And then at the end of the meeting, we were told that nothing spoken in that room that day was to ever leave that room. No one in that room was to talk. No one in that room was to speak about any of the issues, our reason for being there. We were sworn to silence. And then we were told that once he'd completed his disciplinary period of time, that his ordination would be restored and any record of anything he had done would be erased. And so that began 2 years. During that 2 years, he also made a very firm decision. My husband and I had been thinking, do we put our kids in the Christian school? Do we put our kids in the public school? I was a wreck. I was not in any condition to make any decision about my life. I really wasn't. I look back on it now and think, oh my goodness, I should have been in therapy. I should have been in therapy at this point, and I wasn't. I was making all of these decisions just out of a sense of protection and a need to hold things together. And so we got told that our kids weren't suited to the Christian school. I think in part because the school they'd been attending in Mongolia was much more relaxed. It was a school with many international students there. So the way they educated and taught was a much slower method. It wasn't as rigorous as your average Christian school is going to be. And so they told us, your kids aren't suited for this. And I can remember my husband getting off the phone, and it was, not a cell phone. So he hung it up on the wall and he said, we're going to homeschool. And that's when my world became that of a conservative, evangelical Christian woman homeschooling her children. And it stayed that way until 2018. That's what I was. From 2004 to 2018, I was a conservative Christian, stay at home homeschool mom.
Just for context, this whole time you were obviously extremely wounded.
Yes.
And this was chaotic, but you, in terms of the worldview overall, you were still not questioning whether or not it was mythology. It was still all real to you.
No, to me, it was real. The suffering helped me identify with Christ. The fact that I couldn't rely on my husband helped me rely on God more. I spent, and this is where my Bible study really, really kicked up. During this time in my life, I was putting in, I would say on your average day, 2 hours of Bible study. I actually did a verse by verse study through the Bible for 3 years. I had my Strong's Concordance. I actually had 2 different Strong's Concordances, one for King James and one for NIV. I had a Vine's Expository Dictionary. I had Haley's Bible Handbook. I had
Kay Arthur?
all kinds of, I'm sorry?
Kay Arthur? Did you have her stuff?
Oh, I had Kay Arthur stuff. I had our own denominational teachings, A.B. Simpson's whole series through the Bible that he had written. I had some John MacArthur stuff, his whole series through the Bible on tape. Don't get me started on John MacArthur. I'm going to stop right there. I had, and this is where I say I was probably spending more time studying the Bible than the men I was listening to on Sunday morning. I honestly believe that. In a couple of cases, I know it for a fact, because they would admit how much time they spent in sermon prep. And I would be like, yeah, I'm doing more than you.
Was that for like a project, or you just wanted to be in the Word?
I just wanted to be in the Word. I just wanted to be in the Word. I felt I had to get grounded somewhere. And I couldn't trust in the world. I couldn't trust in a worldly view of anything, because I knew, and this comes into that, I didn't talk about my marriage ever with anyone. I didn't tell people what it was really like ever. But I very much knew that if I said out loud what my marriage was like to someone who was in the world, or to a secular therapist, or maybe even to a Christian counselor, they probably would have said, you need to get out of that marriage. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to stick it out. I wanted to prove that the Bible was true. And if I just submitted and I just kept forgiving and I just kept my eyes on the prize, I kept my face toward the cross, whatever cliche you want to use in there, that God was going to honor that. I truly believed it with my whole heart, that if I obeyed the word and if I kept honoring God, God would honor me. I really honestly believed it. And as a woman in the church, you are told that if you submit, God will take care of you.
Yeah. And that was very common too, I think, in a lot of the resources that were out at around that time, if I remember correctly. Trying to think, Stormy O'Martian, The Power of a Praying Wife.
Oh yes.
And even just straight up in scripture, it talks about First or Second Peter, that if a wife, a Christian woman, has a husband who's disobedient to the word,
exactly,
that her good behavior will win him.
Her good behavior, and that's what it was. I was going to obey. It was going to be my good behavior. I was going to honor God. No matter what happened, I was going to keep moving forward. And that continued through a couple of moves. What I now think was probably another affair or two that I did not uncover and did not get confessed. Just the circumstances were the same. And we eventually ended up in a small rural church in Virginia where we had built a house, and that church was non-denominational. I was kind of burned out on the CNMA. I was kind of done with that, and I didn't want to head down that path anymore. I had refused. My husband had completed his disciplinary time, and during that time, disciplinary time, though, is when I had learned that he had done things like leave our children alone at night and whatnot. That kind of slowly seeped out as I talked with my kids, some of the stuff that had gone on. And I had children who were having night terrors regularly. And my oldest begged me, Mommy, don't make me go back overseas, because for him, he associated that trauma with where we lived, and he couldn't separate it. And I didn't know about things like post-traumatic stress disorder. I didn't understand anything about trauma. I didn't understand anything about anxiety. The only thing I knew about anxiety was cast your cares on him, be anxious for nothing, that the Bible tells you. So I just kept moving forward, but I refused to go back overseas. When they said, we're going to send you back overseas, we're going to send you straight back to Mongolia. And my son just was begging me no. And I was thinking about it frequently, and I was absolutely heartbroken. And I can't tell you how many people tried to manipulate me into doing otherwise. But I eventually, and it was the first time in my marriage that I said no to my husband. I said, I do not want to go back overseas. I do not want to put our kids through that again. I think we need to put the family first. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking, let's see how this goes. If it goes good, then I'll go back overseas, because I still had that dream. I was supposed to be a missionary. This was my calling. This is my education. So I still wanted the possibility to be there, but I refused at that time to do it. And in 2016, the weekend before my ex left, he sat me down and he said plainly to me, I decided to leave you that weekend that you told me no. So that was in 2007. So from 2007 to 2016, he had been in a long-term plan to leave me. So here I was trying to make him the hero. He was the godly man, and he was the family leader, and kids, honor your father. And I was doing all that work constantly. And during that time, he had just planned that he was going to be gone. So this notion that a woman obeying God will receive a blessing and protection from God was very quickly deteriorating. I was realizing, okay, so there's a couple things that aren't true in the Bible, like how you handle discipline in the church and how you deal with a leader who's causing harm. Well, that doesn't work out the way they say it's going to work out. And, I had seen the lies, I had seen the cover-ups, and now I was seeing that no matter how hard I worked to be an obedient wife and a good mother, it was never going to end up in what God had promised and the church had promised to me. So it wasn't my first time to question the veracity of scripture. It wasn't my first time. I had done it a couple other times in my life. I kind of had a hard time believing in a literal hell. Like when you die and then you wake up and you're either burning or you're praising Jesus. I had a hard time grasping that. I never really fully accepted that exact literal concept. But I had never denied the faith about it. I just thought maybe it's not quite what we think. So there'd been a couple of doubty type of things in me, probably no more than the average Christian might go through. But all these promises that were so often given just became pure nonsense. And there was no way around it. It was just surrounding me every day, that it was nonsensical.
Can I ask, was there any part of you that, I know a lot of people would probably say this at this point too, but did you have any sense in your mind of, I'm just in the wrong denomination, I'm in the wrong interpretation, I'm not
Yes.
just the idea that, there's going to be, of course, 1,000 other people that are going to say, our church would have never done that. And our church,
gosh, of course.
And like, did you get that sense of like that maybe like at any point in that journey, I know not at the end, but did you get a sense at all at points that like you just needed a better group of church leaders involved or a different denomination?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when we started attending that smaller non-denominational church, they had a covenant, and it was a fairly standardized covenant that you believe in inerrancy of scripture, you believe in baptism, you believe the Holy Spirit is indeed genuine. You believe that there are spiritual gifts. There were a few very basic beliefs. You believe in there was no specific end times belief or anything like that. And so I thought, well, here we go. Here's former Mennonites and former Presbyterians and former Christian Missionary Alliance people and former evangelical free people and a former Southern Baptist as the preacher. And that's going to make it better. That church is going to be a healthier church to be in. That church is going to be one that really honors God genuinely, because they're not serving a denomination, they're not serving an institution, they're just serving Jesus. So there was very much this aspect that I felt, if we get into that church, it'll be healthy. That's just going to be a healthier environment. And finally, I'll find real health and real goodness in the church. And so I fully expected it. That's what I had hoped for.
I can't help but think, just I say this tongue in cheek, of course, and no disrespect to them, but the picture that comes to mind is if you're in one environment where there's poison, you go to another environment where instead of it being that particular kind of poison, it's instead just a lot of different kinds of poison. And it's like, okay, in this one we had, a gallon of strychnine. And this one, we're going to just do a half a cup of strychnine, but we're going to do a cup full of snake poison from the copperhead and, mix it all together. And like, somehow it's going to get better. And it is amazing, that sense that like, and I think a lot of people would have this interpretive response to say, you were just in the wrong group. I've had people tell me, even just in the very broadest sense, I'm really sorry you just never heard the voice that, your church didn't teach you to really hear God's voice, whatever, all this stuff. But there's never a willingness to step back and say, maybe the system is the problem. Like any version of it, the system is the problem. And it's just, there's this, I mean, it's like anything, we all say it as a cliche, but people with power want more power. And once you get these people with power in across the board, it just sets itself up. And, a lot of that is patriarchy very directly, but you mix this stuff up, and it's like you're switching churches is going to, it's going to hit the reset button a little bit like like a video game. Oh, Mario died, so hit the reset button and Super Mario starts over. But it's like, it's not really going to be a different outcome in the end. And
exactly.
It's got to be frustrating. Did you, when you're going through that, just if I could just ask for more on the quietness of your own heart, like when you're in bed at night, just thinking, this is really nasty. This is awful. I'm alone, next to somebody, but alone. Did you ever despair to the point of like, I'm not sure this is worth, like, did suicide or self-harm come into the equation?
Mm.
Or was there always this settled sense of like, no matter how dark the valley of death is, the Lord is my shepherd. I will get through
Right.
this. He will take me to the other side. And though he slay me, yet will I trust him. How did you, what was the depths of your emotion at that point?
Um, about 2 years before our separation, um, was when a lot of that church scandal stuff, and I don't know if you would remember this, but I was in the homeschool world, deeply in the homeschool world, and there was a lot of church scandal that came up. Major things, the Gothard thing with the accusations of somewhere near 40 women coming out and saying, yeah, when I was a teenager, he did these things to me. And there were the Willow Creek preacher and
Vision Forum.
one, right, Vision Forum with Doug Phillips. And I mean, there was like maybe a handful, maybe more than a handful. There was of just in the homeschool community. And then you add in stuff that was starting to show up in the Southern Baptist Convention. And then you add in for my denomination, I don't know how many people know, but Ravi Zacharias was ordained by the Christian Missionary Alliance. They were his ordaining body. And a woman came forward and said, this man is propositioning me online. And they denied her. And they, First Timothy 5:19, you can't even entertain an accusation against a man of God unless there's witnesses. And all she had was emails, and those could have been forged or falsified. So he did nothing wrong. You can't just trust a woman. You can't just trust a woman. Women are deceived. They're deceivers. They're weak. So all these things were going on. And my husband was showing all the normal signs of having an affair. He was coming home with another woman's hair on his clothes, the smell of perfume. He'd come straight in the door and shower. He wouldn't wear his ring to work, things like that. And because I'd been down the road so many times, I knew the signs. It just was what it was. And I had started to despair. An element that I haven't brought in up to this point is that when my son was very young, I had started to realize that he wasn't like your average little boy, and had actually gone through Focus on the Family and had a little bit of counseling from a famous reparative therapist to try and counteract what were seen as homosexual tendencies in my little boy. And so through all of this turmoil, I also had dealing with my son. And at this point in his life, he was 15 and 16, and Mama was fully picking up on the fact that the stuff the church said didn't work, didn't fix it. The stuff the reparative therapist, psychologist said didn't fix it. And I was starting to fully realize that my son is a young gay man, and I wasn't willing to admit that. So there was a lot of stuff coming in right at that point in my life. And I was beginning to despair. I was really beginning to despair. And my husband kept weapons. He had two pistols. He had a 45. He had a 357 police revolver. And then he had some shotguns and a hunting rifle. And I mean, in the environment where we live and in the church, that's very normal. It was something I had just always accepted. But at this point in my life, I was getting very, very low. You know, as you said, you're laying in bed with someone and yet completely alone. And I knew every night that I was completely alone. He had, by this point in our marriage, made it more than clear to me that what I was going through, whatever it was, whether it was with the kids or with the homeschooling or what personally, didn't matter. I had to deal with my stuff by myself. And so I had reached the point where I went to him one night and I said, I need you to either lock up your guns at work or lock up your ammo at work or something. I said, I am, in the depths of despair. And I'm not sure what I expected from him in that moment. I'm not sure. I think I wanted to believe he cared. I think I wanted to believe he loved me. But I had reached a very, very low point. And the next morning I woke up. And as it was our habit, he kept the 45 under the mattress during the day. And at night, he would set it on his nightstand. And I woke up the next morning after that conversation where I had asked him to lock up his weapons or lock up his ammo separate from the weapons or something. And I rolled over to get out of bed, and there was his 45. And for whatever reason, it was laying so that I was looking down the barrel. And I kind of jumped up out of bed, just kind of startled. And I thought, oh, he took the ammo, and that kind of shows you my mindset. My mindset was, this man loves me, and if I just do enough right, he's going to love me, and I told him what I needed, and he heard me, and he took the ammo, and I picked up the gun, and it was loaded, and the clip was full, and I could tell by the weight in my hand. And in that moment, kind of almost felt like, you've been bit by a snake and you want to shake it off. I just lifted up the mattress and threw the gun under the mattress, and sat down on the bed and cried. And I think two things happened in that moment. One, I realized he doesn't care at all. And two, I got a resolve in me that for whatever reason, I have to hang on. For whatever reason, I have to hold on to life for the sake of my children. And that became, that wasn't the only moment. It was in a very similar time period that my son kind of hinted that he might be gay. He kind of tested the waters one day at dinner at the table, and I stood up and ran out of the house and drove, and thought, I'm going to just drive for a bridge. There's some pretty deep, big rivers where I live, and it happened to be at a time when they were pretty full, and I thought, I'll just do it now. So there were a couple of very, very low moments right there, because, I was still searching and looking. So I resolved after I made that resolve that I was going to stick it out for my children. I felt desperate, because the fact that what I'd been taught my whole life evidently was not true. And I mean, when you talk about truth, for me, truth has to be proven. Truth isn't faith based. Truth has to be facts based. And here's this thing that I have been trying at that point in my life, it had been for like 30 years, to see the truth work out. And the truth there was no follow through. There was no truth there. There was no anything really. And so I thought, I still believed. So I've got to find something somewhere that makes sense. And so I started reading Pete Enns. I started a little bit of more progressive theology. I kind of logged into a couple of more conservative Christian groups, but groups that are trying to expose and correct abuses. And they're few and far between, and they're very, very small. And I praise their efforts. They're making effort, and they're genuinely good people, I know. But still, I was trying to find something. I was looking desperately everywhere. And about that same time, I started to get into social media more. I clicked and logged into a few like chat rooms for Christian women who'd been through abusive relationships or abusive church circumstances. So I was desperately clinging. There was that hope in me that I will find this answer. Maybe I am just in the wrong church. Maybe I am just following the wrong theology. Maybe I am just reading the wrong version of the Bible. By that time, I read through more than, I don't know, like 6, 7, 8 versions of scripture. I'd read all the way through on multiple occasions. I will find the truth. I was certain I would find the truth. Um, then the Trump thing happened. And I have to tell you that that kind of closed the door on me ever expecting the truth from evangelical Christianity. That was like the that was like taking the head off the chicken on the chopping block. I mean, I was like, okay, no more of that. And I continued to read a little Pete Enns and a little stuff from the Christian left, and eventually realized that even for them, what they're choosing to believe, they're believing on faith. And Pete Enns even says what he chooses to believe, he believes on faith. And I started to realize I don't have that faith, but I wasn't really willing to say it out loud yet. My ex left me, and I finally started talking to people. This would have been maybe 1 year after that kind of suicidal ideation was big going on with me, is when he left. And I started talking to people. And for the first time ever, I said, this is what my marriage was like. And people's jaws just dropped. They couldn't believe it. They could. I had been so good at covering things up, and he was so good at presenting himself as a godly man that no one could believe what our house was like. And my children were actually not initially, of course, they were sad that he had left, but eventually, really quickly, they came to realize how happy and peaceful our home became when he wasn't there. And we really started to develop a close relationship. And they were getting older, they were leaving high school. Mom was having this internal struggle with all the things she'd been taught all her life. And she was looking at these kids. I mean, I was homeschooling them, they were graduating homeschool. Half of their homeschooling, I swear, had been doctrine and Bible, character building stuff. And I was just, I didn't want to say anything to them about my faith struggle. So I just kept it to myself. And I just kept desperately searching. Then I talk about it in my blog. An incident happened where my daughter ended up in an abusive relationship. And it's really not that abnormal when a child's been raised in a home where an abusive relationship is an example before them, that they then go out and imitate that. And she walked straight into an abusive relationship. And when she tried to break up with the young man, he actually started threatening her life, started threatening the life of her sister. We eventually had to get a temporary restraining order. And about 4 or 5 months after that order had been placed, my pastor invited the young man to come back to our church and attend with us again. And he did it based on his ability to discern the young man was a completely changed individual who loved God, and by that point, I've been having a couple years of struggle and reading and studying. But when he sat across from me, and I was again a woman essentially being silenced and put in her place in front of a man who was telling me that because of his, and I'm just going to say this as cleanly as I can, I have another way of putting it, but because of his genitals, he's better able to understand God and God's word and God's decision making and God's thought processing than I am. And he told me that I was being a little rebellious, and maybe I was just acting like a teenager who'd never had a and I told him on the spot, I said, I'm done. I'm not going to be a member of your church anymore. I just want you to know that I'm not doing any more ministry in your church. And I was still, doing a little reading at that point. I think I was reading The Sin of Certainty by Pete Enns, and I was also reading C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity. And I was sitting in my car one night, picking up my youngest from a theatrical performance practice that she had. And I remember reading Mere Christianity and looking down at it and realizing that Lewis was talking in a circle. He was using circular reasoning as to why he believed. And I didn't even have the words or language to say that, but my brain recognized it. And my brain said to myself, this is ridiculous. You don't believe this. And I knew at that moment that I had crossed the line. I had crossed the line from this wholehearted, sold out to I don't believe this anymore. I don't know what I believe, but I know it's not this. And it was maybe another 3 or 4 months of sitting through church still, even though I told the pastor I wasn't going to be a member. I didn't want anything to do with membership. I didn't agree with his theology. I'd made that clear, but I was still going to church a little bit. And I was just sitting there one Sunday, and I knew that Sunday when I walked out the door, I knew that was the end. And when I sat down in my car, I knew I wouldn't be back. I just had reached that point that there was no more to give. There was no more belief. Um,
Hmm.
I I just had this total break, and it wasn't really a fast break, because it had been years building. Um, but it was a clean break. It wasn't an emotional, I'm done dealing with this and I'm rushing out. And there wasn't any of that. It was a thought out reasoning that I can't keep doing this. I can't keep walking in here every Sunday and sitting down and listening to this and acting like I think like the rest of these people think. I can't do that anymore. And that was just after Easter in 2018. So in
Amazing.
that time, right, I had gotten divorced. And my kids were still attending church, but I had gone through all these shifts. And in 2018, I'd finally reached that point where I could say no more.
That's what I was thinking is it's like it just piled and piled and piled on. Like
Right.
it's just like a machine gun barrage and you're
Right.
just dodging bullets everywhere.
Right. And sometimes I giggle when I talk about it because to me it seems so absurd that so many things had to happen. And it just tells me how much dedication I had that it took that much. I mean, some people would have been out the door the first thing that happened. Some people have said, I'm not doing that again, but I just kept going back for more and going back for more. And yeah, it really was it took both the intellectual side and that last moment where the church just had to do something awful again. And I could put the two together and say, okay, now I can step away. Now I'm at peace.
Hmm.
And I really am at peace, like that peace that passes understanding that I had been promised all my life came to me when I stopped going to church on Sunday. I mean, that's when it arrived. That peace that I don't have to, I don't have to do this anymore. That's that's when it showed up. And that was really striking to
Amazing.
me. That was really striking to me. I was very shocked. I didn't expect that. I expected, to be struck by lightning or something horrible to happen to me that would just ruin my life and prove that, God was there. But instead, I just had peace in the decision. I've never doubted it since, not once.
Hmm. I definitely can ditto what you're saying. I tell people that in the first day and maybe even in the first hour of my deconversion, I definitely had more peace than I had in 40 plus years as a Christian. It just,
Right.
I mean, to me, it's like realizing that you've truly just been brainwashed your whole life
Right.
and almost like or almost not just brainwashed but like how you might see those really
Uh-huh.
scary movies where somebody is like put in a coma, but it's not like by doctors, it's like by a bad person who got the right serum and can literally like keep you in a coma, and you're
Right.
kind of aware that they've got very sick intentions, but like that, it's like that kind of nightmare, and it's like you suddenly are free of all this coma inducing medicine, like you're finally able to think for yourself and move for
Right.
yourself, and you're like, this
Right.
this has been a prison this whole time. And the thing about, it wasn't quick. I've used this illustration before and I'm not sure if it's a perfect one, but it helps me to think through it. I feel like that how people set up like 1,000 dominoes and then they'll tip one and then they all fall. it
Uh-huh.
felt it felt to me
Yeah.
like what was going on with me all this time, and parallel to what you're saying, is if my worldview dominoes were like a mile away, like it's
Mhm.
like you just can't trip them that quick. It's just so solid, it's so far. But it
Right.
was like these little steps, and maybe if it's a mile away, one little teeny shuffling is not going to be enough that as you're kicking, you're not going to kick it
Right.
down, you're just too far away. But
Mhm.
eventually those little shuffles those little steps add up, and before you realize it, you just kick one last, and that one last kick, it feels the same as all the other kicks, but
Right.
you're close enough now to the final stage where you're like, bam, and it just all drops. And
Right.
mine was literally like in an hour. It just I've told people this before, so I'll keep it short, but I literally just was arguing with myself. I was like, say it, Tim, say it. And the words in my mouth, in my mind, that I was trying not to say were, it's not real. It's like, say it, Tim, say the words, it's not real. And as soon as I said it in my mind, I thought to myself, there's no way that this planet has been en masse deceived for 2,000 plus years. There's just no way that all of us have been that deceived. And I
Mm-hmm.
thought about it for 30 seconds. I was like, that doesn't make sense. Of course we could be deceived. We thought the Muslims were deceived this whole time. The Buddhists were all
Right.
deceived.
Right.
Why couldn't we have been too?
Why couldn't we have
Why
been?
couldn't we have been? And it's like, say it. It's not real. And I finally gave myself that freedom. And it felt like I was like seated in front of a fire hydrant and someone opened it. Like I was locked down in the chair, and
Right.
it just flooded, and it's just bam. And like you said, once you're out, you can't go back there. And even just for your church, I was thinking, as you're describing your story, like, yes, they're exposing their gross toxicity, but you also realize they're just not your people anymore. And
Oh gosh, no.
I don't
Uh-uh.
think they realize that what that effect does to people when they're like, you're not healthy, but also you're not my people. Like, I can't be safe in my own skin around you. You know what I mean?
Right. And that I tried to maintain two friendships. I tried for about the next year after I left the church to maintain two friendships with women that I had met in that congregation. They had both been kind and helped me through my divorce. They had been encouragement to me, but they kept defending the pastor's actions in the case of my daughter's abuser. And um, it it got to the point where I realized we can never come to an agreement. We can never come to an agreement because their mindset is still back there and my mindset is out here, and I'm changing too fast. I was changing too fast, and sometimes I want to say maybe I wasn't changing. Maybe just the real me was shining forth. The real me, that social justice oriented, very verbal, very outspoken person was now allowed to speak.
Mm.
And she was also allowed for the first time in her life to say no. And that was, when I walked out the door that Sunday, I was essentially saying no, even though I didn't use the word. And and every moment after that where I got to say to someone no, I felt like I was like Rocky in Philadelphia up on the stairs with pumping my fists in the air. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I really had in my mid 40s just gotten this ability to suddenly be who I was. And I learned that she was still that same person. She was
Mm.
still that person who wanted to do good. She was still that person who wanted to help others. I mean, my career is not a high paying job where I get a ton of money and I'm going to make it big. It's a service oriented career where I help others and I study more to learn how to better help others, because that's who I am. And it wasn't who I am because of Jesus. It's who I am. Whether I have Jesus or not makes no difference. Actually,
Mm.
it does make a little difference because I'm more free to be who I am.
Mm.
And that has been just life changing. I can't even begin to describe it. Just life changing.
Mm. I feel like I've got 100 questions. So if you're okay, I'd love to you just could have, so to speak, put a pin in it and say I would like to do a follow up at some point if you're willing to. I know
Okay.
you're moving and so forth, but when things settle down, but if there is so
Sure.
much to unpack there, and especially I'd love to just talk more about what you just referenced, and the idea of the autonomy, getting your voice back, your power back. It's stuff that, when you look back at it, you just think this should have been something I was equipped with from childhood to have my own voice.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I do with my kids is I'll I'll pretend they've got a bubble, like, like an astronaut's helmet of where it's like clear, but just all clear, or just an actual like soap bubble. And I'll say, I want you to pretend that that's your worldview. And I'm going to put my hand, and I'm going to come inside the bubble. I said, and I'll say something like this: I want you to think just like me. And they'll say, no, you have to think just like the church. No.
Oh.
And I'll say, I want to control your worldview. No. And then we'll do this other thing where we often do this in the car. It's just like a silly game, but I'll say, who has the power over what you believe? And they'll say, we do, I do, whatever. And then I'll say, does daddy have power over it? No. Does mama? No. Who has the power? And they just keep on saying, I have the power. I have the power. And I love that they get to, that sense, but it's like, when you look back at it, whatever, illustration you would use, like, that's what we all should have had this whole time, is to say, you're allowed, like, I want you to know what I believe or don't believe. I want you to have access to my worldview, but you don't have to think like me. And especially without the fear of the judgment. Like, if you don't think like me, Big Daddy in the sky is going to get you bad for it. Just that lack of threatening. It's and the social, if you don't believe like us, we're going to ostracize or shun you.
Right.
It's amazing the difference that makes in life. So I'd love to unpack that more with you at some point. But can I ask, just for wrapping up today, where have you landed with all of your worldview? Like, what do you think or don't think about the afterlife? And you mentioned you're out of church, but are you out of Christianity?
I would have to say yes. I am definitely outside of Christian faith. I see value in some of it. I see, there's a blogger named Neil Carter, and he describes the Christian faith as being helpful to some people. Like, some people need that to be good people. And I can see some value. I can see some value there, but I do not possess the ability to have faith in that system of belief at all. So I would definitely say I'm outside of Christian faith. I am outside of the church. I would describe myself, I guess I would have to say, as agnostic, in the sense that, and I know there's a lot of argument in the world. There's a lot of argument that, well, if you're agnostic, you're really an atheist. And but do I believe that somehow something could be there and show me? It's welcome to try. That's kind of the mentality I have. The mentality I have is, I am not going rigidly into anything. And so if I had to describe myself just as a person, I would say I'm a humanist. I am a humanist. I believe more and more, as I've studied outside the church and read and studied some history and some sociology outside of the church, I more and more believe in a more humanist perspective, in the ability of man to work together and to love their neighbor without being told to love their neighbor. And some of the people outside the church that I've known are head and shoulders above the preachers I've known, are head and shoulders above the church elders I've known, as far as their ability to love their neighbor, to take care of each other, to serve other people. And so I would put myself in that category. I would say I'm a humanist.
I love it. I love it. And thank you for mentioning Neil Carter too. He's a great guy. I hope to get to interview him at some point too.
I'm sure he would.
Again, I know that a lot of my interviews, some people, their interviews are more just matter of fact, this happened and this happened. But some of them, you can tell that these are very painful topics to think through, to talk through. And, sometimes I can get the sense that, people who are telling the story, and also even myself as the hearer, like, it's like you have to almost decompress after the interview, because it's like, this is a lot of stuff. And
it is.
I know that it takes a lot of vulnerability and just strength and bravery to share your story. So I just want to say, for this first interview, thank you so much for being willing to go down these hard roads, because
thank you. I appreciate it.
People need to hear, what actually happened, which you did too. But just being willing to share your kind of behind the scenes heart in it all it shines through. And I'd say this in a lot of my interviews, but number one, the big issue is you escaped. So that's awesome.
Right.
Congratulations.
And it honestly feels like it. Yeah.
Yeah. You did escape Bible prison. But in the big picture too, you're doing what you need to do to heal and to turn your healing out, to help other people. So from the bottom of our hearts as a community, thank you for who you are and what you've been through. And we're willing to take the ugliness and turn it into something beautiful. So we really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm very glad to do this. I didn't know what to expect, and I've really been glad to talk with you. And I hope that, if people who have struggled through something similar or maybe are struggling, my email is in my blog, and they're welcome to contact me, and I'd be glad to chat.
Awesome. And I'll have all the links as well beneath our video, so everyone can go right there and connect with Stephanie. But I'll just end by saying we've been speaking again with Stephanie Logan. Stephanie, thank you so much. It's great to get to know you, and thank you again for sharing your story.
Nice to meet you, Tim.
Thank you.
And bye.